Hey guys, tonight we're talking about prisons, but not the Hollywood kind with yard workouts and philosophical bunkmates named Red. No, we're diving into the worst cages humanity ever cooked up. Imagine jail, but with more rats, fewer windows, and no toilet. Your cellmate might be plague-ridden, your food might still be moving, and your only escape plan? Death or becoming a best-selling memoirist. So, dim the lights, maybe put on some calming rain sounds, because you're going to need something gentle to balance the horror we're about to unleash. Let's begin with the ancient world, where prison was less about rehabilitation and more about making sure you never saw sunlight again. Chapter 1. Ancient World, Babylon. Welcome to the ancient world. Not the romanticized golden age with scrolls and sandals, but the rotting underbelly. Babylon, cradle of civilization, birthplace of bureaucracy, and home to some of history's most profoundly unpleasant jail cells. If you stole a goat, annoyed the local priest, or just owed someone the wrong number of bushels of barley, congratulations, you're going to prison. And by prison, we mean a glorified pit carved into the dirt outside city walls. There were no walls lined with iron bars, no polite wardens with keys jangling at their belts, just a hole in the ground and a heavy rock rolled over the top. Justice here wasn't interested in reform, it was interested in deterrence, ideally the kind that could be smelled from 30 paces. The Code of Hammurabi may have been carved in stone, but your sentence was carved into your spine, one miserable hour at a time. Once dropped into your dust-slick oubliette, time slowed. You were fed sporadically, usually a thin porridge tossed in by someone who couldn't be bothered to check whether it landed near your face or your foot. Water? Sometimes. Hope? Never. What made Babylonian dungeons especially cruel wasn't what they did to you. It was what they didn't do. You weren't interrogated. You weren't tried quickly. You just sat. In the dark, in the wet, in the stink, until either the judge remembered you existed, or the worms finished filing your paperwork. And if you think there was a bed, think again. The only thing you slept on was dirt, and maybe the corpse of whoever got sentenced last. Comfort was not on the menu. Neither was survival. Chapter 2. Ancient World, Egypt. If Babylonian dungeons were pits, Egypt's were puzzles, darker, quieter, and wrapped in incense. Justice in ancient Egypt didn't always involve tossing you into a hole right away. Sometimes you had to be ritually humiliated first. The Egyptians had a complicated relationship with imprisonment. On paper, their justice system was deeply spiritual. Crimes weren't just offenses against people, they were offenses against Maat, the divine balance of truth and order. But when that balance tipped, it didn't fall gently, it crushed. Most prisons in ancient Egypt were attached to temples. That's right. The same temples where priests chanted to Ra and prepared offerings were also the same places where you could end up chained to a wall next to a bucket of something that used to be soup. A spiritual cleanse, just with fewer candles and more screaming. These weren't sprawling institutions. They were cramped, chokingly hot stone closets carved beneath sacred buildings. Some were only shoulder-width wide. You couldn't sit without curling like a dying scorpion, and standing felt like punishment in itself, especially when the ceiling kissed the top of your skull every time you tried to stretch. And the smells? A unique blend of rotting sweat, stale beer breath, and limestone dust. Combined with torch smoke and ceremonial oils from the upper floors, it made for an aroma you could only describe as divine decay. Guards were priests, and not the nice ones who offered blessings and bread. These were temple enforcers with long staffs, judgmental eyebrows, and absolutely zero interest in your version of events. you were guilty. Your confession was merely a formality, one they would gladly help you discover. Torture wasn't systematized like in medieval Europe. Instead, it was ritualized. You might be beaten with reeds until you saw Osiris, then left tied in a supplicant's pose, on your knees, arms overhead, hands bound, so the gods could witness your remorse. If your arms didn't fall off first, if you were especially unlucky, they'd blindfold you and spin you in circles through temple corridors before locking you in a pitch-black room to break your sense of time, direction, and memory. By the time you reached your final cell, your mind had been softened like overcooked lentils. Occasionally, prisoners scratched notes into the stone. Not prayers, not curses, just words like remember or the light came at noon. These weren't graffiti, they were anchor points. Proof that someone had once been there, and maybe escaped, if only in their mind. And if you were released, you weren't restored, you were marked. Tattoos, shaved heads, or scars on the wrists marked you forever as someone who had offended the gods and survived their judgment. People didn't trust you. You didn't trust sunlight, and your shadow always walked a few seconds behind. So, next time you see hieroglyphs on a temple wall, don't just think poetry and pharaohs. Somewhere beneath that temple, someone may have left a message in blood and grit, a whispered reminder that justice and cruelty often share the same priest. Chapter 3. Ancient World, Rome. Now enter Rome, the empire that gave us aqueducts, roads, and a legal system that still echoes through modern courts. But when it came to prisons, Rome had one idea: make the process so unbearable that trial or execution felt like a reward. The Mamertine prison was the most famous, or infamous, subterranean horror show Rome could conjure. Built beneath the Capitoline Hill, it sat like a tumor in the heart of the empire, right next to temples and monuments, because nothing says civilization quite like a sewer-fed death pit under your town square. You weren't admitted. You were dropped, like waste into a sewer that wore a temple overhead. A literal trapdoor in the floor of the chamber above dropped you like spoiled grain into the darkness. It wasn't even a prison in the modern sense. There were no corridors, no communal areas. Just two stacked cylindrical cells with stone walls, fetid air, and floor slime so persistent it had its own calendar. The upper chamber was for waiting, the lower for dying. There were no beds, no torches, no sense of direction. The air was damp and metallic, the kind of sour that clung to your hair and stained your thoughts. The floor? A mosaic of mud, human waste, rat trails, and bones so picked over even the rats looked bored. You weren't fed on a schedule. You were fed when the guard remembered. And the guards always remembered. Not to care, they didn't even speak to you. They shouted instructions down the hole like calling for a cursed dog. Food might arrive in a bucket, or a basket, or land on your face if your luck was particularly Roman that day. And water? It came with conditions. You might get it if you were nobility. If you were a slave or a rebel, the best you could hope for was condensation on the ceiling, and the patience to lick it before it fell back into the puddle of someone else's disease. Some prisoners were kept for days, others years. Political prisoners, senators, generals, rivals, were held just long enough to disappear from public memory. Sometimes they'd be strangled in silence, sometimes marched out to the Tullianum's execution chamber, where the floor sloped helpfully toward a drain. Easier cleanup. Public executions were theater. You might be escorted from your pit at dawn, blinking like a mole, to the cheers of a crowd that wanted to see your blood feed the soil of Roman justice. Sometimes your throat was slit on the steps. Sometimes you were paraded to the forum and offered one last chance to confess, weep, or say something memorable enough for a scribe to scribble. But make no mistake, the Mamertine wasn't about justice. It was about removal. Rome didn't need a prison system. It had a disposal system. And yet, some prisoners endured long enough to be remembered. Saints Peter and Paul were both held in Mamertine before their executions. So were kings, generals, revolutionaries, each one left in the dark long enough to realize that Rome didn't break you with chains. It broke you with neglect. So the next time you think of Roman civilization, marble statues, poetic speeches, clean lines, and finer virtues, just remember, for every senator in a toga, there was someone 10 feet below him, curled in a cell with no name, no trial, and no air that didn't taste like despair. Chapter 4. Medieval Europe, Tower of London. Ah, the Tower of London. A charming riverside fortress with sweeping views of betrayal, royal backstabbing, and the kind of hospitality that came with the shackles and a complimentary rat infestation. Tourists today marvel at the architecture. Inmates, however, remembered it as the last place they saw daylight, or kneecaps that still worked. The tower wasn't originally built as a prison, but somewhere between royal residence and oops, we beheaded another cousin, it evolved into the most feared detention center in England. Being sent to the tower didn't mean you were going to jail. It meant you were entering history, usually as a cautionary tale or a headless footnote. Let's talk about the rooms. Some were palatial by dungeon standards. High-ranking prisoners like Anne Boleyn or Sir Walter Raleigh had fireplaces, furniture, even writing desks. But don't get excited. This was just the British way of saying, you'll die with a view. Others weren't so lucky. The infamous Little Ease was one of the tower's most creatively cruel inventions. A 4-foot stone chamber where you couldn't lie down, stand, or stretch without dislocating something important. Prison yoga, brought to you by medieval sadists. Stay in Little Ease long enough and your muscles forgot how to relax. Your joints felt like they'd aged 70 years, and your dreams were narrated by whatever fungus had started growing behind your ears. Food? Technically, yes. Moldy bread, sour ale, and if you were lucky, some meat of uncertain origin. Your jailer might accept bribes for better meals, or he might take the bribe and still feed you pigeon bones boiled in cabbage water. It was a culinary gamble with low odds and high nausea. What followed wasn't a question. It was a ritual. A slow unraveling masked as mercy. The tower had a whole arsenal of persuasion tools. The rack stretched you until your joints popped like bubble wrap. The scavenger's daughter did the opposite, compressing your body into a human paperclip until your blood tried to escape through your pores. There was also waterboarding, iron collars, and the charming medieval tradition of hanging people by their wrists until their shoulders divorced their torsos. Why all the torment? Confessions, signed documents, a chance for the crown to look pious while wringing out another heretic or rebel like a wet towel. Your screams, if loud enough, might even reach the river. Not that anyone listening was going to swim upstream to help. Some prisoners stayed for years, Jesuits, rebels, spies. One poor soul carved 300 Latin phrases into his cell wall, not as a warning, but just to stay sane. Another reportedly tried to train a spider as a pet, until it too escaped, presumably seeking better conversation elsewhere. And then there were the executions. The tower's courtyard played host to some of the most famous final beaux in British history. Anne Boleyn, executed after a hasty trial and a hasty poem. Lady Jane Grey, queen for 9 days, prisoner for longer. Thomas More, who refused to say Henry VIII was the Pope now, and got rewarded with a clean slice to the neck. But for every noble death, there were 10 quiet ones. Forgotten traitors, unfortunate knights, people who fell out of royal favor or into the wrong bed. Their names didn't make it into the history books. Their bones, however, might still be under the stone floors. And worst of all, the silence. When the guards stopped speaking to you, when your cellmate died and no one came to remove the body, when days turned to weeks and all you heard was the Thames lapping gently outside, reminding you that freedom was close enough to hear, but never touch. So yes, the Tower of London had stunning architecture, but if the walls could talk, they'd scream, and they'd ask, "Did you bring bread?" Because the rats are still hungry. Of course, the tower wasn't just for traitors and wives who failed to produce sons. It was an equal opportunity destroyer of clergy, scribes, poets, and even the occasional bishop with a questionable sermon. If you could speak, write, or wear the wrong colors near a nervous monarch, the tower was always hiring. One prisoner, a Jesuit named Henry Walpole, was tortured so severely that the iron manacles wore holes through his wrists, not metaphorical ones, literal holes. His bones pierced the skin like teeth through overcooked meat. And when the guards noticed, they just chained him by the ankles instead. Adaptability was key. And the weather? London wasn't known for its sunshine. The cells were cold in the winter, humid in the summer, and eternally damp. Even the spiders wore tiny cloaks. Stone walls sweated through the night, and wooden doors warped just enough to creak every time you tried to rest. Sleep was optional. Paranoia was not. Some prisoners went mad, others got creative. Sir Walter Raleigh, imprisoned for years under suspicion of treason, built a small laboratory in his cell and wrote an entire history of the world. That's right. He got locked up and responded by inventing indoor homework. Honestly, he should have been punished for ambition alone. But not everyone had that mental resilience. Some scratched words into the walls, names, prayers, curses. Others just stopped speaking altogether. One woman, imprisoned for suspected witchcraft, went blind from being kept in the dark so long. When they finally opened the door, she wept, not from the pain, but because her eyes remembered nothing but black. Escape? Technically possible. Practically suicidal. The tower was surrounded by guards, walls, and a river that moved like molasses during winter and like a murder scene in spring. One prisoner tried to swim for it. He made it halfway before the current snapped his leg like a celery stalk. The guards fished him out with the same effort you'd give to scooping soup. In short, the tower didn't just house prisoners. It staged them for slow decay, public confession, or an eventual trip to the block. And if you were very, very lucky, you might leave with your head still attached. But don't count on it. In medieval England, nothing cut deeper than a king with a grudge. Chapter 5. Enlightenment Era, the Bastille. The Bastille didn't look like a prison, not at first, not from the outside. It looked like a fortress, because that's what it started as. 8 massive towers, linked by walls thick enough to stop cannonballs and bureaucrats alike. It loomed over Paris with the self-assurance of a king's bad idea, casting shadows long enough to swallow a street and wide enough to swallow a man's name. To the outside world it was stone, gray, grim, impassive. But on the inside, the Bastille was a maze of memory loss, a palace of perfectly engineered disappearance. The corridors were narrow. Staircases spiraled in unnatural ways. Cells were stacked vertically, each with just enough variation to keep you wondering whether the next one might have a window. Some did, most didn't. One man said his window showed nothing but a wall 6 inches away. A daily reminder that perspective didn't matter here. The floors were slick with mildew, the ceilings low enough to make tall men stoop and short men paranoid. Rats ran along ledges like they owned the place, and in many ways they did. They were the only ones allowed to leave. There were cells for nobles, large, furnished, and deceptively polite. They had desks, tapestries, fireplaces that didn't work. But the decor was a trick, because no amount of embroidered wall hanging could muffle the silence. And silence was the Bastille's most loyal guard. Lower down were the true oubliettes, the places where names were forgotten and daylight was treated as contraband. Some prisoners were placed alone, others with strangers, always in silence, not enforced, just suggested. Strongly, with a look, with a shrug, with a plate of food that arrived without explanation or warmth. And the food? Bread, always bread. Harder than regret. Served with broth that looked like boiled guilt. Some prisoners joked that the Bastille didn't have a kitchen. It had a geological process. Mold wasn't a flaw, it was seasoning. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, all the same. Sometimes you got cheese, sometimes the rats got it first. You learned to eat slow, not for digestion, for distraction. One bite every 5 minutes to stretch the hour into something survivable. Water was tepid, delivered in dented tin cups. If it tasted like rust, you were lucky. If it tasted like soap, it meant someone in the kitchen had a conscience. Rare, but not extinct. Time wasn't measured here. There were no clocks, no bells, just crusts, prayers, and scratched stone, until the wall stopped meaning anything. And when the door opened, which it did sometimes without warning, you didn't feel relief. You felt confusion, because the routine had become religion, and breaking it felt like a kind of death. The Bastille didn't need guards with whips. It had architecture that whispered, "Stay still." It didn't need chains. It had stone that held memory like a vice. It didn't need violence. It had a meal plan that turned digestion into despair. And that's why it worked. Not because it was brutal, but because it was subtle. Because it convinced you that no one out there remembered you. And worse, that maybe they never did. Whispers behind the stone. Famous prisoners, bureaucratic erasure, and torture by indifference. The Bastille was never short on guests, but it wasn't a prison in the usual sense, more like a political quarantine, a place where you weren't necessarily punished. You were simply removed. Voltaire went in for satire. Simon Nicolas Henri Languet went in for journalism. One man went in for owning a book that made fun of Whigs, another for failing to bow convincingly at a dinner party. Some were nobles, some were servants. All were inconvenient. And once you were inside, the Bastille didn't scream at you. It didn't shove you into chains. It did something worse. It ignored you into pieces. Your name disappeared from documents, or was misspelled so thoroughly it might as well have been someone else's. Some prisoners were locked up without ever seeing the lettre de cachet that condemned them. It was whispered into a clerk's ear, filed by a sleepy hand, and delivered with the precision of a ghost. One signature, one sentence, 0 appeal. The guards weren't cruel. They were bureaucrats in boots. Their orders were simple. Keep things running. Deliver the bread. Slide in the soup. Don't talk. Don't ask. Don't think. And they didn't. One prisoner spent years in a cell that wasn't assigned to him. His meals were delivered by accident. His release paperwork never existed. The guard who fed him retired before realizing he wasn't supposed to be there. Wealth helped, sometimes. Nobles could bribe for better rooms, books, or writing supplies, but comfort doesn't shield you from decay. It just makes it harder to explain why you're falling apart. Even if your room had a desk, you weren't writing to anyone. Letters were censored, delivered late, or simply disappeared. One man wrote to his wife every week for a year. She received one letter. It was about the soup. This was torture by administration. Calendars that didn't turn, pages that weren't meant to be read, names that quietly slipped off ledgers and into dust. And the prisoners, they unraveled in private. Some spoke to the walls. Others played games with the rats. One nobleman recited both sides of chess matches aloud for a year. Eventually, he started apologizing to the pawns. Most stopped speaking altogether. They didn't forget who they were. They just stopped thinking it mattered. Inside the Bastille, your name was no longer a tool. It was something you waited for someone else to remember. It was something you waited for someone else to remember. Rebellion in silence, memoirs, madness, and writing as resistance. When all else is taken, your name, your time, your place in the world, you're left with one choice. Let go of your mind or hold it with both hands until it breaks or bends. Inside the Bastille, some prisoners chose to break, but others, they bent in brilliant, defiant directions. Some whispered poems into the darkness. Others recited speeches from memory. A few built entire imagined libraries in their heads, reorganizing shelves from their childhood homes, book by book, page by remembered page, until they could smell the dust between chapters. Some cracked, some prayed, and some they wrote. The ones who refused to let silence win. Simon Nicolas Henri Languet, jailed without trial for upsetting the powdered elite, spent 20 months in a cell and used the time to compose his most damning work. His memoir sur la Bastille wasn't just a memoir. It was a document of vengeance, a report, a mirror, a knife sharpened with every quiet page. He described the absence of time, the absence of noise, the way the walls seemed to move closer the longer you stared at them. And when he was finally released and published it, the people listened, because they recognized themselves in it. Not in the cells, but in the helplessness. Other prisoners didn't write memoirs. They wrote systems, cataloging everything to stay sane. One man kept a mental diary by assigning smells to each day. Another mapped the squeaks of distant doors like constellations in a sky he hadn't seen in 5 years. There was a woman, noble, literate, imprisoned for heretical opinions, who rewrote the plays of Racine from memory, line by line, speaking them aloud to the stone walls as if they were her audience. Not because she wanted to perform, but because she was afraid that forgetting even one verse meant she was no longer herself. Others wrote messages in thread, stitching initials into their clothes with stolen hair. Some scratched poetry beneath their bed slats. One man carved only one word into the wall of his cell. Still. The guards saw none of this, or chose not to. But resistance was there, not in explosions, but in acts of retention. When your world collapses into stone and straw, memory becomes defiance. To remember your daughter's name, your mother's laugh, a line of scripture, a line of verse. The Bastille was designed to unmake people. And still, some refused to vanish. They wrote, they recited. They whispered their names over and over until they could be heard again, even if only by themselves. The ghost that remained, the fall, the legacy, and the symbol that refused to die. When the Bastille fell on July 14th, 1789, it didn't fall because of strategy. It didn't fall because it was full, There were only 7 prisoners inside. It didn't fall because someone planned it. It fell because someone pointed at it and said, That's the problem. And they were right. By then, the Bastille wasn't architecture. It was ideology built in brick. It was a symbol, a stone metaphor for everything people feared, the monarchy's silent punishments, the nobility's secret influence, and the creeping sense that you could vanish and no one would notice. So when the revolution came, they didn't just take it. They tore it apart. The governor was killed. His head paraded on a pike. The gates were opened. The keys, literal and symbolic, were sent to America, handed to George Washington as if to say, "Look, we did it too." The people dismantled it, not in fury, but in memory. Brick by brick, until the metaphor crumbled too. Not as looters, as witnesses, as historians with hammers. The stones were sold, carried off, built into bridges, libraries, and monuments. The prison was erased from the skyline, but made eternal in memory. France has built hundreds of prisons since, but none of them have carried the weight of the Bastille. None of them have stood with quite the same threat. Because once a symbol falls, it loses its power, and once it's remembered as fallen, it becomes a warning. Today, the Place de la Bastille hosts music, protests, celebrations. Tourists walk across it without knowing where the walls once stood. Children ride scooters where prisoners once dreamed of walking 5 steps in a straight line. But every July 14th, the ghost returns. Not in chains, in cheers, in flags, in people gathering together to remember the day the people answered back. The Bastille didn't fall to artillery. It collapsed under the weight of silence. It fell from accumulated whispers. From the weight of too many names written in silence, from the bravery of people who remembered what others wanted them to forget. Its stones are gone. Its shadow still speaks. And what it says is this: never trust a locked door that doesn't tell you why it's locked. Chapter 6. 20th Century Soviet Gulags. Welcome to Siberia. Not the postcard Siberia with snow-capped trees and vodka-fueled toasts. No, welcome to the part of Siberia that eats optimism for breakfast and spits out bones before lunch. You've been sentenced to the Gulag, not a single prison, but a system of forced labor camps stretched like a network of scars across the skin of the Soviet Union. The Gulag stands for Glavnoy Upravlenie Lagerei, the main camp administration, but to prisoners it might as well have stood for good luck and goodbye. This wasn't jail. Jail had beds. Jail had walls. The Gulag had frozen forests, pickaxes, and work quotas that read like suicide notes. You were sent here not to be reformed, but to disappear productively. Every hour you stayed alive, you were supposed to dig a trench, fell a tree, or move rocks from one useless pile to another, all for the glory of the 5-year plan. Were you a murderer? Maybe. A spy? Perhaps. But more likely you were late to work, cracked a joke about Stalin, or were related to someone who once owned a cow before the revolution. The Gulag didn't require guilt, just suspicion, or convenience, or bad luck. And here you are, prisoner 2749G. No trial transcript, no visitors, no explanation. Just a train car full of strangers, a wool coat that smells like panic, and the distant knowledge that everything you thought about justice just fell asleep in the snow. The arrest. One mistake from vanishing. It rarely started with a knock. More often, it was a pound, on your door, on your life, on the fragile illusion that you were safe. It could happen at midnight, or 3 in the morning. The hour didn't matter. The men at the door wore long coats and blank expressions. Secret police, the NKVD, the kind of bureaucratic ghosts who spoke in paperwork and dragged you into the margins of existence. You might be accused of sabotage, or espionage, or counter-revolutionary thought, which in Stalinist Russia could mean anything from telling a joke about the wrong potato harvest to owning a book with too many adjectives. Sometimes they didn't even accuse you. They just said, "Come with us." And you did, because what else could you do? They didn't explain. They didn't allow you to pack. You were lucky if they let you put on shoes. One woman was arrested while breastfeeding. Her child was left screaming in the cradle as the door swung shut. A man who worked on railways vanished during his night shift. His co-workers thought he went to the bathroom. He never came back. There was no trial, just a paper, stamped and signed, maybe even blank, depending on the mood of the officer or the ambition of your neighbor who had denounced you. Confessions? They were the easy part. Because when you've been awake for 3 days under a bare light bulb, slapped every time you blink too long, and told that your family will suffer if you don't cooperate, you confess to everything. You confess to owning the moon. You confess to starting the plague. You confess to being the ghost of Leon Trotsky back to haunt a steel factory. And when the confession was signed, whether by ink or by blood, you were no longer a person. You were a case file, a folder with a name, a number, and a one-way ticket stamped Siberia. That's how it worked. Not with trials, but with fear, with informants, with quotas. Every regional NKVD office had to arrest a certain number of people. Didn't matter who, just someone. So they pulled names from phone books, from lists of returned soldiers, from anyone whose eyes looked too alert. And the genius of the system? You didn't just fear the knock at your own door. You feared knocking on anyone else's. To be a friend, a sibling, a spouse, that was dangerous. Guilt was contagious, and silence was survival. So when they came, no one shouted. No one protested. The neighbors turned off their lights. The wind held its breath. And the train, already steaming in the yard, waited with its metal jaws wide open. The journey. Trains without maps. Hope without doors. The train wasn't like any you'd ridden before. No windows, no benches, no comfort. Just a metal box packed with strangers and a hole in the corner that passed for a toilet when it wasn't frozen shut. You weren't told where you were going. No destination, no duration, just get in. The guards barely spoke. When they did, it was through the muzzle of a rifle or a boot nudged at your spine. No one dared ask questions. Questions implied you believed there were still answers. Inside the train car, bodies pressed together like firewood. Dozens, sometimes over 100 prisoners crammed into each wagon. There wasn't enough room to sit, so you stood. And then you slumped. And then you collapsed in turns, leaning against each other like rotting scaffolding. The cold was a second guard, quieter, crueler, and more persistent. Frost crept across the metal walls like mold. If your breath didn't fog, you worried you'd stopped breathing. If it did, someone else would try to steal it for warmth. There was no heat, no rest, and no sound. Just the heavy silence of people who knew better than to speak hope aloud. The journey could take days or weeks. Some trains traveled for a month. Others broke down in snowdrifts, forcing prisoners to wait inside a frozen tin can while guards argued over fuel rations. Food came sporadically: hard bread, a chunk of frozen lard, watery soup when the guards remembered. You learned quickly to hoard, to guard your crust like treasure. Some prisoners froze to death, clutching a meal they never got to eat. Water was worse. Buckets were passed around, sloshing with slush or warm water laced with grease. 1 sip per man. 2, if the guard was sentimental. Occasionally, someone would crack and drink snow off the floor, ignoring the gravel. Disease spread faster than rumors. Dysentery turned the floor into a hazard zone. Lice became community members. Typhus lurked in every blanket shared by too many men. But quarantine was impossible. No one could move far enough to matter. When the doors finally opened, you didn't feel relief. You felt emptier, like some part of you had evaporated in the dark, the part that understood time, the part that believed in maps. And outside, a sea of white. Trees like skeletal hands. Wind that bit harder than the guards ever could. This wasn't arrival. This was placement, like an object being set on a shelf no one would ever dust again. The march wasn't ordered. It just happened. Stiff-legged, half-blind, one shiver at a time. Toward the Gulag. Arrival, Siberia. Greets you with teeth. Stepping off the train, the cold doesn't just hit you, it claims you. It seeps through the soles of your boots, if you have boots, climbs your legs, and coils around your ribs like a snake made of knives. The guards yell at you to move faster, but your knees no longer understand commands. You've been in darkness for days. Now the snow reflects so much light it feels like you're staring into the judgment of heaven. Welcome to camp. What kind? It doesn't matter. Logging, mining, railway construction, road building, they all start the same, with a lineup of hollowed-out people and a shouted roll call where names are mispronounced, mocked, or simply skipped. Your new home is a barracks, a wooden shed that leans like it's giving up. No insulation, no paint, no floorboards, just planks, frost, and the smell of people who stopped bathing the day they stopped hoping. Inside, bunk beds, or more often, wooden slabs, stacked like shelves in a human pantry. Each one crammed with bodies pressed together for warmth, which is the only thing more contagious than lice. Your first task: figure out what layer of clothing you're willing to sleep in without freezing, and what layer you're willing to work in without dying of exposure. Spoiler, they're the same layer, and it's never enough. Bedding? A thin blanket if you're lucky. Most share. You learn fast who twitches, who talks in their sleep, and who hogs warmth like a dragon hoarding gold. The walls don't block wind, they collect it. The windows, if any, are shards of ice pretending to be glass. The stove in the center of the room smokes more than it heats, and fuel is rare. If you're caught hoarding wood, the guards beat you. If you don't hoard it, you freeze. Toilets? There are none. Just a pit outside, a few hundred feet from the barracks, dug in the snow and marked with shame. In a storm, the path disappears. You can get lost between your bed and a bowel movement. More than one prisoner died that way, pants down, face frozen, dignity stolen by frostbite. The guards weren't cruel, just indifferent. You worked, collapsed, and repeated. The prisoners? A mix of predators and ghosts, and trust, that was extinct. Your first night, you don't sleep. You twitch, you shiver, you stare at the ceiling and realize this is not a place you survive. It's a place you endure, until your number is called, or your body gives out, or, if you're very lucky, the snow forgets to bury you. And as the wind howls through the cracks in the wood, someone coughs in the dark. Someone sobs, someone laughs. It's not a funny laugh, it's the kind people make when their soul slips on the ice and doesn't get back up. Welcome to Siberia. It remembers everyone, and it forgives nothing. Labor, shoveling, death for bread, rations. The day starts early, not get to work on time early, more like try not to die before the sun rises early. You're woken not by light, but by a guard slamming a stick against the barracks wall and shouting something too cold to be a language. You get up, or try. Every muscle argues. Your breath fogs. Your socks are still damp from yesterday. They've frozen in your sleep and now crack like broken paper. You force your body upright, layer on your coat, if you still have one, and join the slow shuffle toward the gate. Roll call, always roll call. It doesn't matter if it's minus 40 degrees Celsius or if 3 people froze in their sleep. The list is read, your number is barked, miss your name? Punishment, answer too slowly. Punishment. Look the guard in the eye? Congratulations, you've just made things worse. Then comes work. What kind? That depends on the camp. You might be hauling logs through waist-deep snow. You might be mining coal in a tunnel so narrow it feels like swallowing earth. You might be digging a road, not for anything, just because it was ordered. The purpose doesn't matter. The motion does. Each prisoner is assigned a quota. It's always impossible. Cut this many trees, move this many bricks, excavate this many cubic meters. If you meet your quota, you survive another day. If you don't, your rations are cut. And hunger, here, is a blade that doesn't stop cutting. The tools are a joke. 1 shovel per 10 men, a dull axe, a saw with more rust than teeth. Sometimes you carry the logs on your back. Sometimes you drag them across the snow using ropes that bite into your shoulders like insults. Gloves? Luxury. You wrap your hands in cloth, already stiff with old blood and frozen sweat. After an hour, you can't feel your fingers. After 2, you can't feel your name. Breaks are rare. Lunch is shorter than your shadow at noon. A crust of black bread may be a ladle of cabbage water that tastes like someone boiled sorrow. You don't talk. You chew slowly. You try not to make eye contact with the men who've stopped blinking. The work continues until nightfall, which, in winter, means you're stumbling home in darkness, the same way you left. You're soaked in cold sweat. Your spine sounds like a gravel path when you walk. Your knees shake with every step. And then it's back to the barracks, to the coughs, to the cold, to the men who didn't come back. Because that's the trick of the Gulag. The work isn't designed to be productive. It's designed to measure how much pain you can carry before your legs give out. And the guards? They don't care if you cry, they only care that you shovel. So you do. You shovel until your hands crack. You shovel until your lungs ache. You shovel because you know what happens if you stop. And because part of you, the part that remembers sunlight and names and songs, still hopes that if you dig long enough, maybe you'll strike freedom. You won't. But hope, like frostbite, spreads whether you want it to or not. Food, a hunger that eats personality first. If labor broke your body, food broke your spirit, slowly, efficiently, and with state-approved precision. Meals in the Gulag weren't meant to nourish. They were calculations. Every gram of food was weighed, measured, and tied directly to your usefulness. Work harder, eat a little more, fail your quota, starve, but with official paperwork. Your baseline ration, 400 to 700 grams of black bread per day. That's a chunk about the size of your fist, dense, dry, and more stone than flour. If you were lucky, you got a ladle of watery soup. Cabbage soup, the guards called it. It rarely contained cabbage. More often, it featured floating onion skins, slivers of beetroot, or a strange film that suggested it had been cooked once, in 1932. Protein was mythical. Meat? Only if a horse died near the camp. And even then, it was served in such small portions that your molars felt insulted. Fat was equally rare, and when it did appear, It floated in your bowl like a guilty secret. Salt was a rumor. Sugar was a fantasy. Vitamins were something that happened to people in other time zones. You learned quickly, ration is power. Some prisoners hoarded bread crusts under their mattresses, trading them like currency. A bite of bread could get you a favor, a secret, or even a stolen moment of silence. But hoarding was risky. If the guards found it, punishment. If your bunkmate found it, theft, or worse. The constant hunger did more than gnaw at your stomach. It rearranged who you were. You stopped thinking about escape. You stopped remembering family. You started dreaming about bread, not women, not freedom. Just warm, buttered, crusty bread, the kind that cracks when you bite into it and doesn't taste like despair. Prisoners told stories about food just to stay sane. One man recited recipes from memory every night before sleep. Not to tease others, but to preserve some flicker of culture, of humanity. Others invented elaborate banquets in their minds, rehearsing them like theater scripts. Today, I'll have roast duck with plums. Hunger made you petty, jealous, suspicious. You watched your neighbors eat with an intensity that bordered on primal rage. You became forensic in your evaluation of someone else's portion. You hated those with stronger teeth. You hated those who chewed slowly. And when someone died, you didn't just mourn. You wondered if he had any bread hidden in his clothes. The worst part? Even if you survived the work, the cold, the beatings, hunger softened your will. It made escape seem foolish, made resistance seem wasteful. It taught your body to move in smaller, quieter ways, to conserve, to endure, to wither without protest. In the Gulag, food wasn't just sustenance. It was the mirror that showed you what you were becoming. Weather, the cold, that thinks it's a religion. In the Gulag, cold wasn't a condition. It was a doctrine, an all-consuming, ever-present force that demanded daily worship in the form of cracked skin, frozen lungs, and whispered curses muttered into scarf-wrapped mouths. Siberia didn't care that you were hungry, exhausted, or innocent. It cared only that you weren't dressed for survival, and no one was. Temperatures in winter dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius, sometimes lower. That's the kind of cold where boiling water turns to vapor before it hits the ground, and where tears freeze on your face before you can cry them all the way out. Your clothing, a patched uniform, thin cotton or burlap, a coat maybe if you earned it or stole it. Gloves were fingerless, shoes were worn to paper, and socks, if you had them, hadn't been dry since October. Most prisoners stuffed their boots with straw or newspaper. Others wrapped their feet in rags and prayed that the frost would numb them fast. But frostbite was never fast. It started like pins and needles. Then it moved like betrayal, slow, silent, irreversible. First the fingers, then the toes, then your ears, cheeks, nose, blackened, stiff, gone. One day you notice a man limping. The next day, he's missing 2 toes and no one says a word, not even him. What's there to say? Congratulations, the cold won again. Barracks provided little relief. Wood stoves were installed, but there was rarely enough fuel. If you sat too far from the stove, you froze. Too close, and you risked burns. The middle ground was crowded, competitive, and guarded with elbows. Sleeping didn't help. Blankets were thin, beds were shared, and your breath steamed through the boards. You'd wake with ice in your hair, frost on your pillow, and the vague sense that you'd just narrowly survived being buried alive in your own bed. Work continued, of course. Always. Even in blizzards. Even when visibility dropped to 2 feet. Even when your tools froze to your hands. Even when the wind howled so loud it drowned out your thoughts. Guards wore better coats. They kept moving. You didn't. You stood in place, swinging a pickaxe with arms that barely obeyed. You envied the guards, not their power, just their mittens. Prisoners developed rituals, shaking out their clothes before bed to knock off the ice, rubbing snow on their skin to wake up, whispering to their fingers like frightened parents. Anything to keep sensation alive for one more hour. Some lost the fight. They lay down just for a moment, and were found, hours later, curled like statues, eyes wide, mouths open. The snow didn't cover them, it claimed them, turned them into warnings. And still the work went on. In the Gulag, cold didn't wait for orders, it enforced them, and it never slept. Hierarchy, guards, criminals, and the broken chain of humanity. If you thought the Gulag was just prisoners versus guards, think again. The true cruelty of the system wasn't just that it crushed you, it made you complicit in your own crushing. The camp hierarchy was chaos in uniform. Officially, there were guards and prisoners. Unofficially, there were dozens of castes, each stacked atop the next like a pyramid built from paranoia and desperation. At the top, of course, were the guards. They wore uniforms, carried rifles, and rarely spoke more than a sentence. Most weren't sadists. They didn't need to be. The system did the dirty work. Their job was to keep the clock ticking. Wake up, roll call, labor, head count, sleep. Repeat. If someone died, they noted it. If someone escaped, they were blamed. That was incentive enough. But below them were the real enforcers, the prisoner trustees, the pridurki. Chosen from the ranks of criminals, not the politicals, these men were given privileges in exchange for loyalty. A softer bed, a second bowl of soup, the right to beat another man without consequence. They weren't better than the guards. They were worse, because they remembered what it was like to starve, and now they had a stick. Then came the blatni, professional criminals, often violent, tattooed, and terrifying. They considered themselves aristocrats of the underworld. They didn't work if they could avoid it. They ran black markets, extorted the weak, and held court in the shadows of the barracks. To cross them meant losing your food, your blanket, or your teeth. Sometimes all three. The politicals, the teachers, writers, students, and factory managers caught in Stalin's paranoia were at the bottom. Educated, soft-spoken, and deeply confused about how they'd ended up here, they were easy prey. They tried to form alliances. They quoted literature. They asked questions. The Gulag didn't reward questions. It rewarded fists. New arrivals learned fast. Don't talk too much. Don't read. Don't correct anyone's grammar. Hide your hands when they tremble. Lie about your sentence. And above all, avoid eye contact with the wrong kind of prisoner. Some politicals resisted. They taught history in whispers after lights out. They wrote poems with burned matchsticks. Others adapted. They played dumb. They cleaned latrines without complaint. They forgot their old names and learned the rules of survival, the kind that didn't come from books. And beneath it all, everyone feared the snitch. Betrayal wasn't the exception. It was policy, rewarded, reinforced, and expected. Rewarded it. Promised extra bread for a name, a plan, a rumor. Entire sentences were extended because of a joke told to the wrong ear. People vanished overnight after their bunkmate made a quiet deal. Friendship was dangerous. Loyalty, lethal. Trust, suicidal. And yet, somehow, moments of humanity broke through. A cup of hot water shared on a freezing morning. A whispered prayer over a dying man. A song hummed in a language forbidden by the state. The hierarchy crushed most, but some refused to forget what dignity sounded like, even when no one was listening. Resistance. Secret notes, silent songs, and stolen moments. You'd think resistance in the Gulag meant shovels swung at guards or mass uprisings. But no, resistance here was quieter, slower, and infinitely more dangerous. It lived in the margins, in half-remembered poems, in glances held a second too long, in breath that dared to carry meaning. The Gulag didn't just want your labor. It wanted your obedience, your silence, your acceptance of the system as inevitable, which meant that any act of memory, of culture, identity, or choice became defiance. Some prisoners wrote. Not many. Pens and paper were rare. But if you were lucky, if you stole a stub of graphite or smuggled a scrap of newspaper, you could write your thoughts. You couldn't send them. But you could bury them under floorboards, wrap them in rags, carve them into the underside of a stool. Someday, someone might find them, or not. But the writing wasn't for escape. It was proof that you still existed. Others composed songs, sung quietly at night, barely audible, lullabies in Yiddish, hymns in Russian, folk tunes from the Caucasus. Voices rose in whispers and fell like snow, unheard by the guards, but remembered by the men who slept beside them. One prisoner wrote entire novels in his head. Page by page, chapter by chapter, every character memorized. When he was finally released decades later, he wrote them down. Word for word, they weren't just books. They were survival blueprints. Even humor survived. Gallows jokes whispered in the latrine lines. Irony scribbled in the snow before it melted. One prisoner named his lice, gave them jobs, held imaginary meetings to boost morale. Then there were the small revolts, stealing extra rations, swapping work assignments, hiding a sick friend during roll call. None of it heroic in the cinematic sense, but all of it carried the same message. You don't own me completely. Women resisted too. In the female camps, secret schools were formed. Mothers taught daughters how to read using ash on stone. Prisoners sewed hidden messages into quilts. Some organized hunger strikes, brief, terrifying acts of desperation that often ended in beatings, but sometimes forced the administration to respond. And there were escapes, rare, almost always doomed. But some tried. In the dead of night, barefoot and starved, they fled into the woods, trusting snow and instinct more than they trusted their fellow man. Most were caught, some died, a few made it. They became legends, passed from barracks to barracks like sacred stories. But the most common form of resistance? Refusal to forget. Refusing to forget your name, your city, your language, refusing to let the camp turn you into a number. And when release came, if it ever did, the ones who had resisted were often the most broken, but also the ones who told the world what really happened. In a world built to forget you, memory became the most dangerous act. Legacy, the ghost cities of a nation's conscience. The Gulag system officially ended in the 1950s, but it never really disappeared. The camps were abandoned, yes. The prisoners were released or buried. The guard towers rusted. The barbed wire sagged. But if you walk through Siberia today, you'll still find ghosts. Crumbling barracks swallowed by weeds, rail lines leading nowhere, frozen shoes buried in the permafrost, and silence. The same silence that once kept prisoners in line now drapes the land like mourning cloth. What do you do with a place built to forget people? The Soviet government tried to erase it. For decades, schoolchildren were taught that the Gulag was a myth. Western propaganda, exaggerated tales, a necessary measure in turbulent times. Survivors who spoke out were often dismissed. Some were rearrested. Others died before they could write a single sentence. but a few lived long enough to speak. Alexander Solzhenitsyn became the voice of the forgotten. His book, The Gulag Archipelago, smuggled out of the USSR and published in the West, laid bare the machinery of cruelty. It wasn't just an exposé. It was a confession on behalf of a nation, a sprawling, painful, undeniable map of suffering built from thousands of testimonies. And once published, it couldn't be ignored. It wasn't a book of numbers. It was a book of names. Names of the missing, the broken, the exiled, the ones who never got to speak, and suddenly the world couldn't look away. Today, some former camps have been turned into memorials. Places like Perm 36, the last surviving gulag preserved as a museum, where visitors walk through cells and read letters carved into wood, where they stand in punishment cells and feel, for a brief, unbearable moment, what it was like to be forgotten. But most gulags, they've been reclaimed by the land. Forests grew over them. Rivers erased their paths. Villages were built with their bricks. It's almost like the earth itself is trying to forget. And yet, the memory remains. In Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and across the former Soviet territories, the descendants of gulag prisoners still carry the scars, not physical ones, but inherited silences, the kind passed from parent to child like a secret recipe no one wants to taste again. The true legacy of the Gulag isn't its architecture, it's its psychology, a lingering national instinct toward fear, toward suspicion, toward the belief that punishment can come without cause, and survival means staying quiet. But there's also another legacy, one carved into the frost by poets, rebels, and ordinary people who refused to disappear. Because for every nameless grave in the tundra, there's a memoir on a bookshelf. For every letter that never arrived, there's a monument. And for every man who vanished into the snow, there's a name scratched into stone by someone who remembered. The Gulag didn't just try to erase people, it taught them how to endure, and how to remember louder than silence. The bars rusted, the guards retired, but memory, it kept digging. Chapter 7, Religious Europe, the Inquisition. It always started the same way. A knock on the door, not a violent bang, not a gang of armed guards, just a firm, insistent rhythm, polite enough to feel official, cold enough to freeze your bones. It's the middle of the night. You fumble for a robe, you light a candle, you open the door. And the men standing there aren't shouting, they're not angry, they're quiet. Dressed in dark robes, faces unreadable, holding a parchment with your name on it. A summons from the Holy Office. Not a request, a command. You aren't told why, because they don't need a reason, just a suspicion, or a rumor, or someone who whispered your name during their interrogation. Someone said you read the wrong book, or questioned the wrong priest, or failed to show the right amount of enthusiasm at Mass last week. Your wife asks what's happening. You tell her it's probably nothing. You try to believe it. They let you pack. One blanket, one book, preferably scripture. No jewelry, no letter writing. Then they escort you quietly down the street. Sometimes on foot, sometimes in a covered cart. No one screams, no one protests. Because in towns patrolled by the Inquisition, silence isn't just survival, it's civic obedience. And besides, the neighbors are already peeking through their shutters, not to help you, but to remember your face just in case they need to say later, "Yes, we always thought he looked suspicious." That's how it began. Not with violence, but with certainty. The kind that wears a crucifix around its neck and a blindfold over its eyes. And once the door closes behind you, you're no longer a citizen. You're a suspect in a trial that hasn't been written yet. but the ending's already planned. Confession by candlelight. Inside the interrogation chamber. Your cell is smaller than you imagined. Just high enough to stoop in, just wide enough to lie curled like a question mark. The walls weep moisture, the straw stinks of mold and something worse. There's no window, only a slit under the door, and even that feels like a privilege. You lose track of time fast. No sun, no bells, just the occasional creak of boots passing in the corridor. You try to pray, but the words don't come easily in a place built to silence them. Then, one day, or night, you can't tell, the door opens. 2 figures enter, candle in hand, shadows crawling across their faces like ink across parchment. They don't shout, they don't strike you. They speak in measured, deliberate tones. One sits, the other stands. Both wear the insignia of the Holy Office. This is not a man who wants the truth. He wants your version of it, the one where you already agree with him, the one where your soul is guilty, and he's simply helping it confess. He asks questions, slowly, repeatedly, sometimes out of order, sometimes in Latin to see if you flinch at a word you weren't supposed to know. Have you ever spoken against the church? Have you ever denied the saints? Do you know why you are here? The answer to that last one doesn't matter. Because even if you don't know, they do, or they say they do. They have witnesses, unnamed of course, evidence, withheld of course, testimonies, extracted of course, but still, they ask, because they want you to say it. To break your own spine across the confession table, you begin to talk, not because you're guilty, but because silence is a weight that presses your lungs inward. Because they're kind, almost pastoral, and that makes it worse. Because when someone accuses you gently, it feels more like a blessing than a punishment. So you admit to something small, a doubt, a poorly chosen phrase at a dinner party, a book you saw but didn't read. They nod, take notes, ask again. The same questions, twisted just slightly. Your answers change, almost without your realizing. That's how it works. They don't shout the devil into you. They coax him out like a midwife pulling sin from between your ribs. And when you return to your cell, shaken, uncertain, more confused than before, you wonder whether you've always been guilty, or if you've only now started to become it. Rituals of pain and purity, torture tools of the righteous. They said torture was a last resort. They said it was rare, used only when necessary and always regulated. They said a lot of things, but once the questioning stalled, once your answers contradicted, or your memory stuttered, the tools came out. First, the setting changed. You were taken to a different room, larger, colder, walls of stone, darkened by soot and secrets, a brazier in the corner, ropes hanging like dead snakes, chains bolted to walls, and in the center, the table. Wood, stained and worn smooth where too many hands had gripped too hard. They called it the Chamber of Reflection, which was a poetic way of saying, we're about to break you in the name of your immortal soul. You were warned, often with a prayer. Then they began. Maybe they started with the strappado. Hands tied behind your back, body hoisted into the air by a rope looped over a beam, then dropped. Just enough to wrench your shoulders from their sockets, not enough to kill you. A gentle fall, a brutal landing. Or they used the rack, stretching your limbs with slow, deliberate turns of a crank, until your joints screamed louder than you could. Sometimes it was the water cure, forced ingestion until your stomach swelled, followed by compression, forcing it all back out. Drowning without water, choking on holy intent. There was also the garrucha, iron collars that tightened with each breath. or the pear, a grotesque metal device inserted into wherever your guilt was presumed to reside, then twisted open to tear your truth loose from flesh. And yet, through all of it, they kept praying. Some inquisitors read scripture aloud while torturing. Some whispered blessings into your ear between screams. You weren't being punished, you were being saved, one broken rib at a time. The goal wasn't death. That would be too clean. The goal was surrender, mental, physical, spiritual. They wanted you to crumble in the shape of a cross and beg for forgiveness, even if you no longer remembered what sin tasted like. And when you confessed, finally, incoherently, desperately, they stopped. But they didn't cheer. There were no applause. Just a nod, a signature, and the sense that your body had just finished translating your soul's guilt into something visible. You were taken back to your cell. Shaking, bleeding, not relieved, because now the punishment could truly begin. The judgment parade, trials, punishment, and the ghost it left behind. After the confession came the trial, but calling it a trial is generous. It was more like a theater performance, with the outcome scribbled in the margins before the curtains rose. You were led into a hall. Stone floors, heavy tapestries, the faint smell of candle wax and judgment. At the far end sat the inquisitors, black-robed, expressionless, a crucifix overhead, a table before them. Your confession already written. You could speak in your defense. If your jaw still worked, if your tongue hadn't been bruised into silence, you could argue, they would listen, and then they would remind you that God already knew the truth, and that truth was now bound in ink, signed by your trembling hand. Some were condemned to penance, paraded through the streets in tattered robes, wearing conical San Benitos marked with flames or devils, symbols of your heresy. Others were sentenced to imprisonment, forced to live out their days in silence behind monastery walls or underground cells that hummed with regret. But the worst, the most public, was the auto da fe, the act of faith, held in plazas under banners of piety, accompanied by music, crowds, and the scent of sanctified execution. Heretics were marched out in rows, barefoot, some weeping, others silent. The priests led prayers. The officials read out your crimes, misquoting texts you never owned, citing thoughts you never spoke. And then, if you were lucky, they strangled you before they burned you. If not, the fire did the job. Crowds watched, children watched, because this wasn't just justice, it was education. A flaming billboard that read, "Don't ask too many questions." The Inquisition lasted centuries. It left no mass graves, just scattered ash, faded trial records, and a cultural scar that whispers still. Even today, Inquisition is a word people say with caution. A shadow passed down through generations, not because of how many it killed, but because of how quietly it convinced people to kill themselves, to doubt less, to obey more. It didn't need armies, just fear and paperwork, and people who nodded politely while others disappeared, and when it ended, it didn't vanish. It simply left the room, like the last candle going out in a place you didn't realize had gone dark, until the darkness started whispering your name. Chapter 8. Imperial Rule, Ottoman Dungeons. Ottoman prisons weren't hidden in back alleys or tucked beneath castles. They stood in plain sight, sometimes in the heart of cities, sometimes built into the sides of fortresses, looming above the Bosphorus like architectural warnings. They weren't places you stumbled into. You were sentenced to them, sometimes with ceremony, sometimes with a whisper. From the outside, many Ottoman dungeons looked almost beautiful. arched gateways, carved stone, tiles that once shimmered with artistic flair. Travelers even wrote about their elegance. A fortress fit for kings, one European observer said, conveniently leaving out the smell. Because on the inside, beauty stopped at the threshold. The air turned sour, the walls wept, the floor sloped, not for design, but because thousands of footsteps had worn the stone uneven. Chains rusted in corners, the air thick with stillness, and from somewhere deep below, the faint hum of a memory refusing to die. The Ottoman justice system was both structured and slippery. There were courts, there were judges, codice, who quoted scripture and law with equal reverence, and often there were attempts at fairness. The empire kept meticulous records. You might get a trial, you might even get acquitted, but if you didn't, the prison waited. Your sentence might be months, years, or undefined. Political prisoners often landed there without trial at all, just the quiet decision of a vizier, a sultan, or a scribe who owed someone a favor. And you didn't have to be a criminal, you just had to be inconvenient. Ottoman prisons were multi-purpose. They held debtors, rebels, spies, scholars, poets, and political rivals, sometimes all in the same room. They weren't designed to rehabilitate. They weren't even designed to punish directly. They were holding pens for consequences, places where you were forgotten slowly enough to understand what was happening. And they were almost always full. Some were carved into cliffs. Others sat beneath palaces. Many were built as add-ons to older buildings. Theological schools turned into punishment wings. Guardhouses transformed into silence chambers. One prison, beneath Istanbul's famed Seven Towers, became so infamous that its very name, Yedi Kule, became shorthand for despair. It was said that if you were taken there, you wouldn't leave the same man. If you left at all. The descent. What it was like to be thrown into a dungeon that forgot you. You didn't walk into an Ottoman dungeon. You were lowered, dragged, or shoved, sometimes through a door, sometimes through a hatch in the floor. Other times, it was just a narrow stairwell spiraling downward, stone slick beneath your feet, darkness thickening like oil with every step. Eventually, you stopped descending because the walls stopped echoing. That's when you knew you'd arrived. Your cell was not a room. It was a condition, somewhere between cave and tomb. The ceilings were low, the air was damp, the corners were soft with rot. And the sound, it wasn't silence. It was something more claustrophobic. The kind of hush that makes your thoughts echo back at you, warped and untrustworthy. If you were lucky, your cell was dry. If you weren't, it had a thin stream running through it. Part sewage, part groundwater, all disease. Bedding was straw, the kind that squeaked when rats ran across it at night. There were no toilets, no basins, just a dark, fetid corner that didn't bother to pretend, and everyone knew what the corner was for. You avoided it as long as you could. Eventually, you gave in. Everyone did. Light was rare. Some cells had slits near the ceiling, so high they seemed more like metaphors than architecture. Others had nothing. Just a torch in the hallway, carried by a guard who passed by every few hours. Or didn't. Food came irregularly. Water even less so. Bowls were lowered through holes or slid across the floor. And if it spilled, you licked the floor. Pride died fast down here. You weren't always alone. Some cells held 2, 5, even a dozen prisoners. The walls weren't wide enough for personal space, so you got used to sleeping with someone's knees in your ribs. If they twitched in the night, you rolled with it. If they died, you waited for the guards to notice. If the guards didn't, you learned to push the body aside. Most people started to unravel within the first few days. Some paced, others prayed. A few sang quietly until their throats went hoarse or someone threatened to beat them with a manacle. The worst part wasn't the pain, it was the stillness. You could go days without hearing your name, weeks without seeing daylight, and slowly you stopped believing that the world outside the dungeon even existed. Istanbul became a rumor. The sun became a memory. Your past? Just something a stranger had told you once. And when the guards came, if they came, you flinched, not from fear of beating, but from hope. Hope didn't starve, it lingered, just enough to hurt. Pain as policy, torture, strangulation, and bureaucracy by bowstring. The Ottomans weren't amateurs. They didn't torture for fun. They tortured for purpose. Every whip, every burn, every broken rib served a function: to extract confession, enforce obedience, or write history in someone else's blood. Pain, in this world, was a language. And everyone eventually learned to speak it. Torture wasn't guaranteed, but it was always an option. Especially if your case involved treason, sedition, or, worst of all, offending someone more powerful than you. There were official interrogations, often recorded by scribes who treated screams like footnotes. Some punishments were medieval classics: whippings, beatings with iron rods, bones cracked beneath the slow rhythm of bureaucracy. Others were uniquely Ottoman: bastinado, for example, the practice of whipping the soles of the feet with canes or rods. A practice so painful, it often rendered men unable to walk for days, sometimes weeks. But that was the point. You didn't need to walk in a cell. You only needed to talk. Then there was strangulation, the Ottoman Empire's most elegant form of execution. Bloodshed was frowned upon, particularly for nobles or members of the court. So instead of swords or axes, they used bowstrings. 2 guards, 1 silk cord, and a technique perfected over centuries. It was clean, quiet, dignified, in the same way a silent scream is dignified. Sometimes the condemned was informed minutes before. Other times they were summoned under the pretense of a pardon, only to feel the cord slip around their neck like a necklace of finality. Strangulation wasn't limited to executions. It was also used as punishment short of death. Slow, partial constriction meant to simulate death without quite completing the job. Just enough to remind you that life was borrowed and easily recalled. Other methods included branding, disfigurement, and public humiliation, parading a man through the streets in chains, his crime painted across his chest. Not to punish him, to warn you. And yet, despite the brutality, everything remained orderly. Torture wasn't wild rage, it was administrative, authorized, logged, filed. You might be burned, but your wounds would be listed in a ledger. Somewhere, someone had signed off on your scream. The executioners were not monsters. They were professionals, artisans of agony. They offered you water when you begged. They murmured prayers over your broken form. Because the empire wasn't trying to kill your body, it wanted your submission, your signature, your soul. And when the torture ended, assuming you survived, they gave you time to recover. Not because they were merciful, because they might need you again tomorrow. Stone that still remembers, forgotten poets, silent walls, and echoes that still whisper. Most people never left the dungeon, not because they were executed, but because even when they did leave, part of them stayed behind, folded into the stone, trapped between the mortar, echoing faintly through the walls every time another pair of feet descended the same narrow stairs. You won't find many memoirs from Ottoman prisoners, not because they didn't suffer, but because so few survived long enough to write them, and fewer still were believed. Their pain became folklore, their names blurred with time. But the prisons themselves, they remained. The Seven Towers Fortress, Yedikule, still stands. Tourists wander through its chambers now, posing for selfies where men once scratched poetry into stone with bloodied fingernails. Guides speak in soft tones, glossing over what happened in the tower's belly with phrases like diplomatic confinement and historical inconvenience. Other prisons, less famous, were buried under mosques, schools, office buildings, their histories erased with renovations and renamings. But sometimes, during construction, workers would uncover an iron ring bolted to the wall. A shallow pit that once held waste. A hidden passage that led nowhere but darkness. They called them historical artifacts. But the truth is they were memories, the kind that never asked permission to remain. And in songs, old Turkish ballads passed down through generations, you'll still hear them. Verses that mention a lover lost to Yediku, or a father buried before the pardon came. The melody sounds beautiful, until you realize it's a funeral for someone history tried to forget. The Ottoman Empire is gone now, but the prisons it built and the silence it perfected still echo in modern institutions, in systems that detain before charging, in cells where light never visits, in bureaucracies that record pain but never respond to it. Because that's the true legacy of a dungeon, not just what happened inside it, but how long its shadow lingers once the doors are finally opened, and how many never made it past the threshold. Chapter 9. World War II, Japanese POW Camps. You didn't plan on surrendering, no one did. But by 1942, the war in the Pacific wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was a trap, closing around Allied soldiers like a noose soaked in heat and jungle rot. Japan's forces were advancing faster than maps could keep up. British, Dutch, Australian, American units, cut off, undersupplied, outmaneuvered. The radios stopped working. The rations ran out. And the jungle started to whisper. Soon. When Singapore fell, it shattered the illusion of British invincibility in the East. Entire divisions were taken captive in a single day. Officers told their men to stay calm, to cooperate. It won't be so bad, they said. The Japanese are soldiers just like us. They weren't. At least, not in the way Allied POWs hoped. Because in the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was shame, dishonor, worse than death. And so, to be a prisoner, especially a white European, was not to be an opponent. It was to be less than human. Captured men were marched for days without food, beaten for speaking out of turn, bayoneted for lagging behind. If you tripped, you didn't get help. You got a rifle butt to the ribs. Water was a gamble. Medical treatment? Fiction. The sun was everywhere. The jungle, relentless. Flies formed black clouds over open wounds. Feet swelled in rotten boots. Heat stroke blurred faces. Entire columns moved like dying animals, skeletal, silent, slowly forgetting how the war even started. And then, the fences came into view. Wooden, crude, ringed with barbed wire that curled like vines, a watchtower, a few huts, a sign in kanji you couldn't read. You had arrived, not at prison, but at the start of something worse. This was not a camp. Not yet. This was a waiting room for suffering. Rot, rice, and vanishing names. The camp wasn't built for you. It wasn't built for anyone. It was slapped together with bamboo, mud, and a sense of urgency that didn't care about comfort. The walls leaned. The roofs leaked. The beds, if you could call them that, were rough platforms stacked 2 or 3 high, crawling with lice and sagging like regrets. There were no uniforms anymore, no ranks, just a collection of sunburnt, shivering skeletons wrapped in what remained of their dignity. Some wore pieces of old kit. Others wrapped their bodies in burlap, rice sacks, or scraps of curtain torn from a looted hospital. Shoes were a memory. Socks were luxury. Toenails turned black, then disappeared. Your name didn't matter. The guards didn't use it. You were addressed by number or race, or not at all. You learned early that speaking was dangerous, that standing straight was suspicious, that looking a guard in the eye could earn you a slap, a punch, or worse. Meals came twice a day. Meals, of course, was a generous term. A bowl of rice, gray, cold, sometimes crawling. Occasionally, a sliver of pickled radish. If the guards were feeling generous, soup. Watery, greenish, with something floating in it you didn't want to investigate. Some men cried the first time they saw it, not from hunger, but from recognition. They realized this was what they'd be eating for months, maybe years, maybe the rest of their lives. Water was rationed. Bathing happened when it rained. Latrines were pits, overflowing, buzzing, rank. A single misstep could mean a foot in human waste, an infection, a fever, a funeral. There was no medicine. Cuts festered, teeth fell out. Dysentery swept through the barracks like a judgment. One man died from an infected blister, another from a splinter, another because he dared to lean on the wrong shovel for too long. The guards didn't speak English. Most prisoners didn't speak Japanese. Orders were communicated through gestures, shouts, or, more often, violence. You learned fast. Nod when they yell. Run when they approach. Keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, keep your hope buried deep where they couldn't beat it out of you. Sickness became background noise. So did coughing, so did death. The camp was quiet, not peaceful, numb. Men stopped talking, not by choice, just because there was nothing left to say. One day, you realize you've forgotten someone's name, a friend, a bunkmate, someone you once joked with during roll call. You still recognize his face, but the name? Gone, lost in the fog that now sits behind your eyes. And that's when you understand. This place doesn't kill quickly. It erodes. The death railway, building a grave. One spike at a time. You were told the work would be hard. What they didn't tell you was that the work was a death sentence with a schedule. The project was simple in theory. Build a railway linking Thailand and Burma to supply Japanese forces. A stretch of jungle turned into a line of steel. Over 415 kilometers. Through mountains, across rivers, over men's bodies. You started with a pickaxe, then they took that away and gave you a shovel. Then they took that away and gave you a basket. Then they took that away and just pointed at the ground. Dig, carry, pour, repeat. 12, 16, 18 hours a day, under the sun, through monsoon rains, in 100% humidity and 0% mercy. The ground was rock hard in the morning, mud by noon, and quicksand by night. Every step was a gamble, every task a punishment. You slipped, fell, got up, were hit, kept going. Why? Because stopping meant being kicked, and staying down meant being beaten, and dying meant nothing at all, because there were always more bodies. The guards pushed you with boots, fists, bamboo canes, and the kind of rage that only comes from believing you are superior to the dying people you command. Bridges were built by hand. Hills were carved with makeshift tools. Thousands of men hacked through stone like ants carving through granite. Tunnels were dug until lungs collapsed from dust and effort. Some men jumped into rivers just to drown. Others simply stopped eating. You watched as friends lost weight until they looked like shadows, as men worked on broken legs, as a man collapsed mid-swing and never got back up, not from injury, but because his heart chose to stop. Medical care was a lean-to with a blanket and a man with tweezers. If you needed surgery, it was done with a pocket knife, a bottle of boiled water, and someone holding your arms while you screamed. The Japanese called it Takumi no Michi, the engineer's path. The prisoners called it the Death Railway, because by the time it was done, over 12,000 Allied POWs and more than 90,000 Asian forced laborers had died. And when the first train passed over it, the men who built it weren't allowed to watch. Aftermath. Ghosts in uniform and what survival really meant. If you survived the camps, you didn't walk away whole. You walked away hungry, limping, eyes sunken, a heartbeat where laughter used to live, and something behind your eyes that no one at home would ever quite understand. Liberation didn't come with parades. It came with shock, with Allied soldiers stepping into the camps and recoiling at what they saw. Rows of skeletons in tattered clothes, some still trying to salute. Men who hadn't seen meat, medicine, or mercy in years. The lucky ones were taken to hospitals. The rest were taken to ships. All were taken far too late. You were given a uniform again, a name, a number that meant pay, not punishment. But when you looked in the mirror, you didn't recognize the man in it. He looked older, smaller, hollowed out from the inside like a rotted tree still standing. Some prisoners returned to normal life. Others never really returned at all. They had nightmares about the guards, about the railway, about the sound of boots behind them that were too soft to be real, but still made their skin crawl. Some couldn't eat rice again. Others never took off their shoes, afraid they'd be made to run barefoot again. Most didn't talk about it. Not right away, not for years. It wasn't shame, it was futility. Because how do you explain a death that never arrived, only waited? A few spoke. Some wrote books. Others gave interviews. But even then, you could hear the hesitation, like they were still in the jungle, still checking the corners of the room for a cane or a shout. The Japanese camps weren't supposed to be remembered. They weren't preserved. Most were reclaimed by forest or paved over. But the survivors remembered. In trembling handwriting. In choked sentences. In long silences that said more than any court testimony ever could, because what the world forgot, they carried. Not as medals, as shadows. And some of them still do, walking through peacetime like men still waiting for someone to open the gate. Final thoughts. Escape wasn't freedom, it was memory. So, what did we learn? That prison doesn't need bars. That torture doesn't need fire. That cruelty, when done slowly enough, becomes administration. And that silence, heavy, structured, institutional silence, is sometimes the sharpest punishment of all. You've seen the worst, men rotting in Roman holes, queens awaiting execution in stone towers, revolutionaries going mad behind Bastille walls. You've marched through the ice in Siberia with broken hands. You've swallowed jungle air in a POW camp while trying to remember your own name. And in every place the pattern repeats. The door closes, the light disappears, the body suffers, and then the mind begins to fracture. But here's the twist. Not everyone broke. Some prisoners wrote, some remembered, some survived, not just in body, but in voice. They carved truth into the walls. They buried poems beneath floorboards. They turned their pain into testimony so future generations could see what power looks like when left unchecked. Because every cell, whether dug in Babylonian dust or bricked into the side of a European fortress, was designed to do the same thing: erase you, to make you forget your name, and to make the world forget you ever had one. Prisons were meant to erase them. Instead, those prisoners left records. So, as you lie safe in your bed tonight, not shackled, not watched, not counted by number, maybe remember the lesson behind the walls. Freedom isn't just the absence of chains. It's the right to speak, to remember, to resist. And sometimes the strongest escape is the one written down, so no one forgets what happened behind the door that never should have closed. Sleep well, and maybe don't commit treason.